Hello everyone and welcome back to the Relai Bitcoin Podcast. Today I have a legend joining my conversation. Thank you, Saifedean, for taking your time.
Thank you for having me, Julian. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
I'm really impressed of the amount of work you have put out there in the last couple of, 5-6 years you're into Bitcoin, and you wrote the Bitcoin Standard, which is obviously like the orange pilling book out there. It's crazy. Like, do you have a sense of how many books, how many of them you've sold, and how many people you have orange pilled with this book?
I've struggled to get reliable statistics for most languages. I know the statistics for English. There's been about 500,000 copies in all formats in English. And then I know that with the German edition and the Thai edition, together they make about 150, maybe 1,000, something like that.
Wow.
But then there's about another 30 languages that, some of them have a small number of sales, like some of them have 5,000, 10,000, something like that. But some of them I don't have data for. So I'm not entirely sure what the total number is, but I'm guessing we should probably be somewhere in the range of 1 million at this point across
That's
all
crazy.
formats and languages.
Which would make you a New York Times best-selling author, basically, right? If we would look at it from the traditional angle.
Yeah, but I mean, the term New York Times bestseller is one of these fiat terms where everybody calls themselves a New York Times bestseller. I'm not sure. I was reading something about how these labels are just very inflated and debased at this point. So I think it would probably be something that I would be able to claim if I wanted to, but I'm not sure how it works, and I don't particularly care. I let the work do the talking, not the accolades. Plus, I'm not particularly fond of the New York Times or associating with them, so I don't really care.
Yeah, it's just an example, but you're right that these claims to fame or these awards or whatever these are, they are inflating heavily. Forbes 30 under 30. I got into this list last year, and it's actually 90 people only in the DACH region. So Germany, 30 for Germany, 30 for Switzerland, and 30 for Austria. And then there's I don't know how many people are getting into the Forbes 30 under 30 list.
It's about 600 last I heard.
Really? So it used to be 30.
Yeah.
Everything is inflating. But I know so many people that have read the Bitcoin Standard, including myself, obviously. That's also how I got more closely into Bitcoin. I was more into also other, coins back then. And when I read this was what clicked for me. That all the rest, including fiat, is basically really like bullshit, including also stock investing and real estate and all the other assets. And I know so many people that also have referred your book and basically have gifted it to friends that were not into Bitcoin yet, and then they got it mainly because it doesn't really talk about Bitcoin for the first 200 pages. I think this was really what do you think? Why is it that this book works so well to convince people about Bitcoin?
I think this probably has something to do with it. The fact that it takes so long to get to Bitcoin, and it wasn't meant to be this way. When I first wrote it, chapter 8 was chapter 1. It started off with explaining Bitcoin, and then it went back and started explaining money. And then I wrote the whole thing that way, and then I realized no, it would make more sense to just do it chronologically. Start from seashells and work your way up to the problem, and then Bitcoin arrives as a solution. I think that was a good choice because the way that it came about is this. If you want to explain something to somebody, if you give them the why, it's much easier to understand it than to just try and explain technical properties, whatever it is. So beginning with the issue of this is how seashells were money, this is why they stopped working as money, this is how gold replaced them, and then this is why gold stopped working, and then that created fiat, and then within fiat we see this problem, and we see how inflation is a problem around the world, and getting into the details of the inflation problem, which I think this is another aspect of the book that really appealed to people, which is in a sense, it's almost like cheating for me as an economist who's not a fiat economist, because if you are a fiat economist, if you're at a university, you're getting paid from fiat inflation. Your salary comes because of the fact that the government can print money. And the only way you make it as an economist is by not saying bad things about money printing, or not too bad things about money printing. So, if you look at economists today, I mean, there's tens of thousands of people with PhDs around the world, economists writing all kinds of obscure papers about all kinds of arcane little tiny topics that you would expect. You wouldn't expect to have so much research dedicated to them. You see things like Freakonomics. You've heard of that very famous book. The authors of that, this is a very common type of writing where you look at something very obscure, like they passed the law in this country doing X in the year Y, and then 17 years later we look at the impact this has had on something that you would imagine is completely unrelated. And then you see it across countries, and you see that there's a very strong correlation. And they establish all these relationships, and most of these things are about things that aren't really all that significant. And they dedicate so much analytical and statistical power to trying to analyze those issues. But they don't do the same thing for inflation and the impact of inflation, because that's how their bread is buttered. Mm-hmm. They know that if they make too much noise about inflation, they get into trouble. Or not necessarily get into trouble, but you're not going to be the next superstar in your field if you keep rocking the boat. So this just means that there's an enormous market opportunity for somebody to go out there and explain the real issues of inflation to people. And that's what I seized. That's what I did. I just thought, I'm going to write about what I think is important here, why inflation is important, why Bitcoin matters. And for most readers, most of this stuff was completely new, because they'd never heard of it, because even if you've read a lot of economics, most of your economics comes from fiat sources, so they don't like to get into this stuff. So showing just how much of a problem fiat was is a big mind-blowing revelation for most people. Mm-hmm. And then once you explain all of these problems, then you have them ready and prone to receive the orange pill, and to take it with a very big appetite, because okay, now I get what the problem is with inflation. Now I get what the complications of inflation and the implications of it are, and then you come and you just then explain why Bitcoin does what it does in the way that it does, and then everything about Bitcoin makes a lot more sense when explained as a solution for that problem, I think. And I think this is where a lot of people get lost when trying to understand Bitcoin, is that they get bogged down in the technical details. And the technical details are, of course, important. You need to understand how Bitcoin works. But if you begin with the how, it's extremely complicated. And it's very difficult for people to maintain and the ability to study everything and to figure out the why after they've gone through the how. Whereas if you know the why, then the how becomes a lot more manageable. So you get it. So this thing is meant to be censorship resistance. This thing is meant to be inflation resistance. And therefore you can see why it takes the design decisions that it takes and why it follows the shape that it does. So this is what my assessment would be. And I think in particular the part about time preference is something that resonated a lot with people, because this is something that nobody talks about. And I think the original thing that my book did was linking time preference with the hardness of money, which is something, that's never really been discussed this explicitly. So people, first of all, aren't very familiar with time preference. And then even people who are familiar with time preference, it's never been laid out as being a result of the hardness of money so directly. And that's why I think the book can be quite powerful for the reader.
Absolutely. Yeah, many concepts like the time preference, but also like what struck me, for example, is when you talked about architecture, how architecture changed, or how art in general changed, how music changed. and now we have like the music that we're listening to now is really totally different than the music that we listened to when we still had a gold standard. Like, it was classic music, it was nice, it was a lot of effort, it was a lot of proof of work that went into the creation of like everything that Mozart and Beethoven did, and now it's basically just the DJ playing some music that a half AI did, or that you can do in a couple of minutes. Just and this all has to do with time preference and having a money that is based on a hard standard, right? This is crazy. It's really interesting. Did you expect, like, did you try to do this? Did you expect to make a career and a living out of this whole Bitcoin standard? Did you expect that it will go as viral as it
No.
as it went?
No, and initially the motivation was just I need to start writing, and I thought this is just, and I was a university professor, and I needed to publish things, so I thought I'll publish a book that'll help me get promoted.
Hey everyone, this is Anna from Relai. I want to tell you about Relai Private. It's our exclusive service for private clients, family offices, and small and medium-sized companies looking to buy or sell large amounts of Bitcoin. As a Relai Private client, you have a full team focusing on your needs. A dedicated account manager guides you every step of the way. You also get personalized 24/7 support and gain access to exclusive reports and industry insights created by Relai. If that sounds like something you or somebody you know should check out, click the link in the description or head over to relay.app/private.
And I did not think that an academic book on Bitcoin would have this much success. I just went by and did it, and I thought it's, people will, some people will read it, but I didn't think it would be this successful. It did not cross my mind that there was such a market for a Bitcoin book, to be honest. It was just, all right, I should write because I'm spending all my day arguing with people on Facebook and Twitter about Bitcoin, and my wife told me, stop wasting your time on this, and I thought, yeah, I remember, the thing that sparked the whole thing is she said, my wife one day said, you spend so much time writing all these long essays on Facebook and Twitter, arguing with people. You could have written a book in all of the time. And I realized, wow, she's actually right. I should just write a book. So really the idea was I should do something productive that I can get paid for rather than fight on Facebook all day with the same 7 friends. I could write things for the whole world. And indeed, I stopped posting on Facebook and I wrote the book. And it was really like a few months of Facebook posting. Instead of, if you channel all the energy that you spend agonizing on proving your Facebook friends wrong, if you just decide, I don't care what my Facebook friends think, and I'm just going to write something to publish for the world, you could get a lot done, I tell you.
Absolutely. I should start with that. I don't argue that much, but I definitely spend too much time on social media. I could do more. And now what the good thing is, you can just send them a link, right? Whoever wants to argue with you, you can send them a link to the book and then they can read it and it's fine.
Exactly. That was really the kind of the motivation. Like, why do I need to keep repeating this in every essay, on every comment thread, every time somebody has a stupid thing to say about Bitcoin? I could just write the book, and then if they care, they can read the book. And if they don't, well, who cares? I'll write another book.
Yeah, absolutely. The only problem is the book is quite long and it requires some, education, I would say. I mean, it's not super easy and straightforward to read, right? So what do you say, or what's the shortcut? How do you orange pill people if you don't have, if they will not read a 300-page book? Like, how do you do this?
I don't have a good answer for you. I think the answer is for them to just shut up and read. If you don't have time to read a 10-hour book, then I can't help you. Like, a lot of people have this. I get this on Twitter. Sometimes somebody will ask you, can you provide me with a 5-minute pitch for Bitcoin? And the answer is no, you can't. You can't explain Bitcoin in 5 minutes. I mean, I could give you the motivation. Well, it resists inflation. It allows you to make transactions. It's unconfiscatable. It's permissionless. It's apolitical. But none of that will make sense if you just tell it to somebody. Like, nobody's going to get truly orange pilled on their own with a 5-minute elevator pitch, because it raises many more questions than it answers. all right, so there's only 21 million. Like, obviously, if you just tell that to anybody, like me, when I first heard about Bitcoin for the first couple of years, in my mind, yeah, there's only 21 million for now until they figure out a way, until the government captures it, whatever. And so this, it's such a new thing, it's such a revolutionary thing. You can't do it justice in a short period of time. And if you tried, you're going to leave the person unconvinced. And then, that they have all these other questions and it's not going to make sense. So there is a part of me that thought maybe you could summarize this book, maybe I could summarize it, maybe I could write a briefer book. And, a lot of people have written brief versions that are very similar to my book. Like, a lot of people have written books that contain the main ideas in my book, but they contain them quite briefly. But it doesn't look like any of them has succeeded anywhere near as much as mine, because I don't think you can you can summarize and skip over these things briefly. If I wanted to go through my book and try and cut it down in order to get the point across, I probably could edit it down, but I don't think I could cut down more than 10-20% or something like that. If you wanted to cut it down more, you're just going to end up having to make claims that you can't back up, and then you're expecting the reader to just take your word for it, and that's just not going to work. It's not going to have the same kind of impact. So I think if you look at, I mean, this is just my assessment. It seems to me, if you ask people how to get orange pilled, how do you orange pill others? It seems that the most successful thing seems to be reading my book, and some of the other successful things would be listening to several hours of Michael Saylor on YouTube, and that also works very well. But that also takes a significant amount of time. So even Michael Saylor, who's a gigantic giga brain, he can't get Bitcoin down to 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 1 hour or 2 hours. I think even if you wanted to take a Michael Saylor orange pilling class, you're still going to need several hours of hard work. So I'm not sure there's an answer for this. And I did consider writing a brief version of the Bitcoin Standard, but I decided it doesn't really make sense. Some people have written like kids' versions of the Bitcoin Standard, and I think that worked out well. But I mean, it's nice for kids, but other than that, honestly, the answer is, look, Bitcoin is important enough for you to spend 10 hours. And if you're not convinced on it, listen to the audiobook. The audiobook is about 10 hours long. If you don't have 10 hours for something so important, then, tough. Maybe you're just not meant to make it. Not everybody's supposed to make it, I guess.
Like Satoshi Nakamoto used to say, right? If you don't get it, I don't have time to explain it to you.
Well, in my case, I did have the time. I spent a lot of time crafting this book, and that's what I have. But that's it. I can't give you individualized instruction to try and explain it to you individually. You're just going to have to read the book.
You need to want it, and that's why you need to understand the problem so that you are open for the solution, right? Us entrepreneurs are always, told that if you talk to investors, if you talk to clients that you want to pursue, you always need to start with the problem and then bring the solution. What we Bitcoiners usually do, and you changed that a bit, is like we just try to take the solution and put it down the throat of people. Explaining how cool blockchain is and cryptography and these 21 million why is important. They don't care because they don't understand that there's a problem. They first need to understand the problem and find the solution.
And I think for most people, their understanding of what the economic problems are, is massively distorted by the fact that they've been miseducated by inflationary economics. In that, if you ask people what are the economic problems, they'll tell you, there are a lot of economic problems. They'll tell you this is a problem, A, B, C is a problem. But realistically, when you look and dig in, you realize there are no economic problems except inflation. All the other economic problems are inflation. Why is there an unemployment problem? Because of inflation. Why is there a wages problem? Why do people complain about wanting more wages? Because of inflation. If it wasn't for inflation, wages would be would not be a problem, because prices would always be going down, and so people wouldn't need to be asking for raises all the time. And why is there inequality? Well, because some people get to print money for free and other people can't save, and the vast majority of people cannot save. We don't have a form of money. If everybody who's poor today, you look at anybody who's poor today, the last 4 or 5 generations of their family, all their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their great-great-grandparents lived under inflationary currencies, and so they all could not save. And if that was different, if all of those people had a form of money that could appreciate every year at 1 or 2% instead of depreciating at 5, 10, 20, 50, or 99%, they'd be in a very, very different place. If your great-grandfather just saved a little bit of his pocket change and passed it down to you today, it would be very useful for you today to start your life with. So if you understand inflation, you understand that all of the economic problems that you see around you are caused by inflation. And you can't really get that across to people because most of their economics is based on universities that are funded by inflation. But once you do get it across, I think it makes the explanation of economics and the explanation of Bitcoin a lot easier.
Absolutely. But what is the explanation of all these economists why we need inflation?
Well, they need inflation because they get paid from it.
Absolutely, the elite.
If there was no inflation, all of these economists would be out there maybe teaching 5th grade math or something like that. Like, think about what kind of useful skills those people have today. It's really between high school math and middle school math is the where you would put them. But their explanation, there is an infinite number of bullshit stories that they offer about why we need inflation. The most common one is, if we didn't destroy the value of your money, then you would never spend. And then the economy would fall apart because nobody is spending money. Because, the reason you spend money is because your money is getting destroyed, which is ridiculous. People spend money because they need to survive. We spend money because we need to eat, we need shelter, we need clothes. When the winter comes, I'd like to have a roof over my head. Before I go to sleep, I'd like to eat and not go to sleep hungry. So people need to spend because they need to survive. People spend because that's just how an economy works. But we don't need to have our money get destroyed in order for us to spend. Destroying our money just benefits the people who manage to destroy the value of the money and enrich themselves. So I think all of these arguments are completely bogus, and all of our world over the last century has been built around these arguments.
There was one argument that we can grow faster as a society, like we can put technologies out faster if we grow the monetary base, and the point in case I think they use is that, for example, the internet was developed in the 80s after we went off the gold standard. But what they don't say, obviously, is that all these innovations before that were probably even more important than the internet, at least as important. They came about before we went off the gold standard, right? So this argument...
Yeah, and I discussed this in the Bitcoin Standard. I think there's pretty compelling evidence that the golden age of innovation for humanity was in the 19th century, not in the 20th and not even in the 21st century. Yes, of course, if you had such amazing innovations in the 19th century, destroying the currency and moving from a good money to a crappy money is not going to just completely destroy all technological innovation across humanity. Of course, we make an innovation and then each innovation opens new possibilities for new innovations to come along after it comes along. So we invent the steam engine, that opens the possibility for the internal combustion engine, and then that allows us to make a car. And then once we have a car, then that allows us to make an airplane. Then once we have an airplane, we can make rocket ships, and so on. So things build on top of each other, and they're not all going to stop just when we destroy the currency. But the fallacy here is to assume that we wouldn't have any innovation unless we destroyed the currency. I think the far more accurate conclusion is that we would have a lot more innovation if we had a good currency. So both, if you look at it qualitatively, like you just lay out that I do that in the Bitcoin Standard, if you look at the innovations of the golden era, the late 19th century up until World War I, you see all of the most important things in our world today. You see that in the 20th century, the most important things that happened was the popularization and the mass production of 19th century technologies. So the airplane, the car, when you think of these technologies, you think 20th century, because that's when they invaded the majority of the world. But they were all invented in the 19th century. The airplane was 1904. That was still on the gold standard, but effectively I count that as 19th century. Well, anyways, we're not really concerned about the year 1900. We're concerned about the gold standard. And most of these things were invented in the gold standard. What came under the fiat standard is the popularization of those things. And of course, the telephone and the telegraph were invented in the 19th century. Computers were invented in the 19th century. In the 20th century, we just improved on these things. And then, obviously, incredible and amazing things came out in the 20th century. But to attribute these things to the inflation, I think, is completely ridiculous. And the fact that it comes from people whose salaries are paid by inflation tells you everything you need to know.
Mm. But what's interesting is that this inflation and devaluation of a currency, because it's being produced more and more, is happening all over again, many times in history. It's like it happened in Rome, when they put less gold in the gold coins. It obviously now happens with the US printing 80% of all the US dollar in the last 3 years. It just happens all over again. And so, like, why is this happening all the time? And what is the solution in your opinion? Will Bitcoin be able to solve this finally?
I think it happens all the time just because it's very lucrative, and it's you can think about it as like an exploit in software, in that there's just this easy way of attacking anybody's computers where you can take all of their money, and this way is inflation. So and I think the reason it kind of always happens is that there's a cyclical nature to it, wherein as a society becomes more advanced, as it becomes more productive, as it becomes more rich, these things usually come with an increase in trust. Everybody in the society becomes more productive, everybody becomes more trusting of everybody else, and everybody is more cooperative with everybody else. And so if you're born into a society that's allowing you a high level of productivity, this isn't the luck of a draw. Well, it is a luck of a draw, but I mean, it's not just completely random. There are certain things that come along with it. If you have a society that has high productivity, then people have arrived at a point where they can cooperate with one another. You can't have high productivity without the division of labor, and you can't have the division of labor without civilized human beings who are able to deal with each other without there being a bond of kinship tying them. So I don't need to be your best friend or your brother or your cousin in order to trade with you in a civilized society. Even if I've never met you before and you've never met me before, we meet in the street, you're selling oranges in the street. I buy the oranges from you. I never see you again, and yet I have very, very, very good reason to suspect that you're not just going to poison me. And that's what the division of labor is. It allows us to effectively trust strangers. And that's what, the reason we trust strangers ultimately is because, it's not entirely blind trust. The fact that you have a restaurant, for instance, or that you have a factory that's making shoes means that you've invested significant amounts of capital in building this. You hired people, you bought the resources. You didn't do all of that in order to go then and poison people and destroy your business's reputation. So the fact that you invest in capital gives me some kind of assurance that you are invested in this thing succeeding, and therefore you're not going to poison me. That's why it generally makes sense to eat food from a restaurant you've never been to, just because, if it's open, if it's functioning, it's been around for a couple of years, then there's a good chance that it's not out there to poison you. So this all works across everything, but it kind of fails across money for two reasons, I think. On the one hand, money has to, by its nature, centralize in one medium of exchange, so everybody wants to use the same thing as money. And then because of the fact that you need it to scale, you're going to have some kind of trust in the person who's allowing you to move it around, which is the case of central banks with gold. And that just creates a very, very high value to defecting from being an honest member of society. It's just such a big jackpot. And so any person who's slightly morally compromised is going to find this to be a very extremely lucrative avenue to exploit. And so that's why you see it across societies, across civilizations, across time. You see the same thing repeat, which is you get to this point where the society is functional, the restaurants work, the factories work, everybody's productive. But then the devious people in society get into the central bank and they start making more money. And you see it happening all across. I mean, you mentioned the Roman Empire, you look at the Chinese Empire. All throughout history, the same thing happens. It's almost heartwarming to see how universal the experience is. We are one human race united by being robbed by our central banking overlords across all cultures and civilizations. So this is, I think, why. And the reason it always keeps repeating is that ultimately, because money is a network technology, everybody is stuck into it. So the majority of people don't care and don't have the ability to verify. But if you want to verify, what can you do? What can you do if you don't believe in, if you don't want to be part of inflation? How can you opt out? Well, you can opt out by opting out of the division of labor, opting out of civilization, but that's even more expensive than being a victim of inflation. And so there's no way out. But with Bitcoin, there is. That's why I think it's really the solution to this problem, because, we're going to continue to see people rip each other off. We're going to continue to see central banks and do the things that they want. But at least all of us who are smart enough to understand what's going on can opt out. And I think on a long enough time horizon, we're going to see that it's going to be more and more of these things getting repeated. And the result of it is that only people who use Bitcoin are going to be protected from this stuff.
Mm. Yeah, because finally we have a way, as you say, to opt out, and finally we have a form of money that is not centrally controlled and cannot be printed. It's that easy, right? It cannot be corrupted. It's really that's the USP of Bitcoin. It's not too hard to understand. So you are working with Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. What is it exactly that you are doing with him? On what kind? Are you advising him on a regular basis, or what are the topics there that kind of are interesting to him, or that you are helping him with?
Well, I mean, I should say I'm not working directly with him as much as it is with the Bitcoin office, which he works with. But my role is advisory in the sense of looking at topics that are of interest to people in El Salvador and to Bitcoin in El Salvador, and just offering my opinion on them and on how they could benefit from them. So it's not a very specific job. I don't have any kind of executive authority. I don't have any kind of strict remit of and scope of work. I discuss ideas that I find relevant. Anything that I hear is happening in El Salvador that I think I could have an opinion on, I discuss with them and I try and offer my opinion on it. And I hope to be able to provide them with some value.
Do you think that there are other countries that will be following the suit of El Salvador, especially in South America, but maybe in other countries and other continents as well?
I have no insight on these things. I have no idea. Perhaps. I hope so. But I have no any kind of personal insight on any of these questions. If there's any other country out there planning to do something like this, they have not told me.
All right. So, is there another book coming up that you are? What is it that you're working on that will be published next?
So my last book was Principles of Economics. I just published it a few months ago, and it's a textbook in economics. It's the book that I would have wanted to have at university. It's my third book, so I did the Bitcoin standard, then I did the fiat standard, which is applying the same method that I used to explaining Bitcoin to explaining fiat and how fiat emerged and what it does and what the implications of fiat are. And then I wrote Principles of Economics, which is what I would have wanted to have at university to teach economics from the Austrian perspective. Now that these three are done, I've just started my own publishing house where I'm going to start publishing books, my books as well as other people's books. And the first book that I'm publishing with this publishing house is called Fiat Food. And this is the work of an investigative journalist, Matthew Lysiak, who read the fiat standard, and his mind was completely blown by that story, in particular chapter 9, which is on fiat food. He read that chapter and his mind was blown. He didn't believe it. He's an investigative journalist. He's written books about crime before. He's investigated crimes. And he thought, this is crazy. This can't be true. This guy has to be making all of this stuff up, because if it's true, it's the crime of the century. So he started digging into it, and he found that pretty much everything is true. But I didn't get into it in a lot of detail because my book is not an investigative journalist's book. It's not a crime investigation. It's an economics book. So I just kind of explained the broad outlines of the players and the incentives that were involved. And he wanted to dig into it deeper, and so he emailed me and said, this is fascinating, I'm researching it, I want to write another book about it, would you be interested in publishing it? And he just wanted me to publish it because he thought the natural audience for this would be my audience who read the fiat standard. And so I went along, and I was independently considering making my own publishing house, so this came at the perfect time. Mm-hmm. So I read the book. I helped him with the editing, and then I decided that I would add a couple of chapters to it, which are the things that I thought what I would like to communicate on this topic of fiat food. So I'm kind of a co-author on it as well as the publisher. So now it's out. You can get it from my website, thesafehouse.com, or from saifedean.com, which is my personal website, or the new publishing house website, thesafehouse.com, as well as Amazon. And it's a really, really good read and really good engaging book.
I bet that there's interesting kind of facts and stories about how food developed that people wouldn't know. Is there any particular example that you find interesting to share?
Well, I think one of the things that I found the most fascinating is the process by which the political class in the 1960s and 70s embraced inflationist ideas, accepted the idea that they were going to move off the gold standard, and started to lie about food. You can see how this emerged and how there was an incentive to get into it, and you can see where the political motives were to go ahead and do this. And I think that is a very fascinating part of the story that's well worth looking into.
Right, I will definitely do. All right, thank you so much, Saifedean. This was really a great conversation, very inspiring, as I have expected. Thank you so much for sharing your time, and I wish you all the best with your new book. I will definitely look into it, and all the best with your work, also with El Salvador and all the other stuff you're doing. Keep on, and thanks for your work in the industry.
Thanks a lot, Julian. Have a good day.
Cheers, you too. Bye.
Bye-bye.